Great to be here, and I'll just kind of, I guess, begin by saying a lot of people think about energy as a very technological subject, and thinking about the energy transition away from fossil fuels toward more renewable-based energy systems as very technological. And what I've come to focus on in my work throughout the past couple of decades is the social and political dimensions of energy innovation. And so we can think about innovations not just in terms of technological innovations, but social innovations that are intricately linked with technological shifts. So that's kind of my orientation for how I think about and how I engage in this subject in my research, in my teaching, and in my community engagement. So I want to introduce this concept of energy democracy, which is an idea that I've been exploring. And I'm going to make sure we have time for plenty of questions and interactive, and feel free to interrupt me at any time if you have clarifying questions or anything. And I'll just, what I thought I'd do is kind of give an overview of a few different things that I've been thinking about and working on. I'm going to start just by saying I am actively involved in policy, in thinking about advocating for change. So I'm also a representative of an academic. I really think we have a lot of responsibility and opportunity to be involved. Right now in Massachusetts, there is an act being proposed for 100% Renewables Act as a goal for the state, and there's efforts to get campuses to also, and organizations and communities to embrace this goal. I teach a class, and today, this afternoon, we're actually debating whether or not this is an appropriate goal, and there's a lot of actually controversy among energy experts in the academy who are critiquing whether or not it's achievable or not, and whether or not it's helpful to have this goal. But my own view is that it is helpful to have a very ambitious goal, and because the changes that need to happen or ultimately are going to be happening anyway, one way or another, really are going to be really revolutionary, transformative, deep changes. And I think it's very valuable, especially a place like Massachusetts or specific communities or specific organizations that are able to be innovative and figure out a way to demonstrate that we could actually be 100% renewable, I think is really powerful. So we can talk about that more in the discussion too. And so what I wanted to talk about is kind of orient just a few kind of concepts that I'm going to go through. First of all, thinking about renewable energy transformation and this transition or major societal shift that we're in the middle of. Then I want to talk about Northeastern, where I am a professor now, has a new Global Resilience Institute. So I've been thinking a lot about this term resilience, and I'd like to connect my work with that. Then this concept of energy democracy, as I mentioned, which is really about connecting the energy transformation with social justice issues. Rather than thinking about energy and renewables as purely climate mitigation tools, pointing out all the other societal benefits of moving toward more renewables, which are many, and they have nothing to do with climate change, and some of them don't even have anything to do with environmental issues, what we usually think of as environmental issues. So I think it's really important for us, as we are engaging on these subjects about energy, to recognize all the multiple reasons why a societal shift toward renewables is really important, and it's not just climate change. And then I want to talk a little bit about diversifying the energy sector and some work I've done on that, and expanding energy teaching and learning. I'll end kind of with that. So I already got a very good introduction, but I also wanted to give you a little bit more context of who I am and how I'm doing this work. I was born in Dublin, Ireland. My family moved to Boston area when I was 8. And as was mentioned, I did my undergraduate here at Harvard. And at that time, I knew I wanted to do environmental work, and I thought water was the most important issue that I wanted to focus on. So my undergraduate kind of focused on water treatment. Then when I went to graduate school, I was focused on water. I joined an aquatic chemistry lab research team, and that got me into actually soil chemistry. And then my project ended up being about how carbon dioxide was impacting soil and water chemistry. So that is kind of the segue into how I ended up thinking more about climate and carbon management. So then when I came back for a postdoctoral research, here, actually, I worked with Kelly Sims Gallagher, who some of you may know. She's a professor at Fletcher, and did work on carbon capture and storage, which is a particular technology, kind of the clean coal idea of we could still use fossil fuels potentially, but we could capture carbon dioxide and store it underground. And so I started doing some work in that space. And so I think it's helpful to also think about, for all of you, when you think about your careers in environment, you know, you might focus and begin in one space, and then you could evolve to something else, right? And so I think it's helpful sometimes to see that. When I then went to Clark University, which is in Worcester, about an hour from here, and I was a professor there, studying kind of socio-technical dimensions of energy and climate. I was then up at University of Vermont for 2 years, and Vermont is a very interesting state, has a very strong commitment to the renewable energy transition, and they had a specific faculty position, endowed professorship, focused on renewable energy transition in Vermont, and so I held that post for a couple of years. And now I am back at Boston at Northeastern, and teaching in this space and doing research there. So what I want to, I mentioned I was going to orient in terms of this like big societal transformation that we are going through. And as I mentioned, it's not just a technological substitution. Oftentimes people think of it, oh, we're just going to switch this for that, right? But everything else will stay the same. And realistically, and when you look at the social and cultural and institutional changes that are going along with that, that model of technological substitution is not really helpful. And the other thing that's really important to acknowledge is that a transformation of this magnitude in humanity is going to be disruptive. There's no way that there can be a transformation of this magnitude that is not disruptive. So resistance from powerful entrenched actors is inevitable. And that's clearly what we're seeing, right? Very obviously right now. We can accept that and expect it almost. And it wouldn't be a big transformation if we didn't have that. So hopefully that might be helpful to acknowledge where we are right now. And when you talk about a transformation of this magnitude, it doesn't mean it's a linear, smooth progression. And so these arrows here are showing that, you know, there's some times when it might look like we're actually going backward, and maybe this transformation isn't happening. But I would argue that, again, with a transformation of this magnitude, there might be times, periods of time, it's not a smooth ride. And sometimes it might look like we're going backward, particularly in the United States right now, in terms of accelerating fossil fuel extraction rather than reducing it. But that doesn't mean this transformation is not happening. And so I think that's an important point to think about. And the other one is that disruption of this magnitude really creates opportunities for social, political, economic, and cultural change. And that's where I like to focus right now. And that's what I'd like to invite you all to kind of think about and explore with me in the next few minutes here. So there's a new concept, an emergent social movement called energy democracy. So it uses these two words that we know very well, energy and democracy, and puts them together. And it's really, as I mentioned, it's really connecting the notion of energy system change with social change, and integrating concerns about the environment, climate, and social justice, and income inequality, and racism, and inequality and distribution of wealth, and human rights, putting them all together and connecting the possibilities with this transformation in energy systems to also create benefits in all these other areas. So it really envisions an alternative model of shared distributed wealth, new legal and governing structures, and really community-based rather than corporate-controlled energy systems. And because energy is so fundamental to everything we do, if you have more community-oriented energy, there are all kinds of other aspects of our lives that could also be more community-oriented rather than corporate-controlled, because so many things in our society are actually in the best interest of corporations rather than communities and individuals and people more generally. So that's kind of the big picture introduction to this concept of energy democracy. What I wanted to do now is kind of step back and introduce a new initiative at Northeastern, which is called the Global Resilience Institute. And what Northeastern has done as a kind of very innovative university trying to be responsive to the world, trying to change the way academics teach and learn and do research, is they've made an investment internally to put together this institute that's a university-wide institute involving faculty and students from all 9 colleges at Northeastern. And it is set up to really acknowledge or kind of align people's work and their efforts toward this resilience imperative, which is the idea that there are so many disruptions of all kinds in the world right now. Those disruptions, whether they be climate disruptions or political disruptions or terrorism or all kinds of different things that are happening, that a strategy of trying to minimize each one of, or predict each one of those kind of disruptions isn't going to work, because there's just so many possibilities. And we know there's going to be more frequency, more intensity of all disruptions of all kinds. So the resilience approach has a threat agnostic perspective. So you just kind of assume there's going to be things are going to, you know, there's going to be big disruptions, and how can we be ready for them, preparing for them, adapting to disruptions as they occur, and then learning from them, right? Because they're going to happen again, or we're going to have opportunities for learning and change as we go through disruptions. So the idea here is this is not just physical infrastructure, but also social infrastructure. And this is not at any particular scale. At Northeastern, we're really taking a broad view of what this even means. We're talking about individual resilience, right, which is health and mental health. We can talk about infrastructural resilience, which is more about, you know, our infrastructure and our, we can think about community resilience, which is our social networks and how we connect with each other and support each other. And we can think about resilience of governance or organizations. You know, there's all ways of thinking about resilience. So it's a very broad theme, and it, you know, comes up with some similar challenges to the word sustainability in terms of what it means, and it could be everything, or it could be, you know, and that also has a scale issue. But it's a useful way of kind of orienting our university and what we're doing at Northeastern to think about, the idea here is also to encourage big interdisciplinary collaborative research that is engaged in a different way than traditional academic research. So I meant to mention, when we talk about disruptions, we're not just talking about discrete disruptions, but also slowly emerging disruptions, which includes growing inequality or sea level rise, or racism is very disruptive, and it encourages vulnerability, so it's the opposite of resilience in that sense. It's about social and technological change, innovations, and it's a university-wide institute, and we have representatives from all 9 colleges, and we have seed grants where we're encouraging different kinds of research, and it's a breadth of different kind of research. So within that, we have the Northeastern Collaborative on Resilient Energy, and that's a cohort of faculty across several, not all 9 colleges perhaps, but all the people who are doing work on energy. So when I came to Northeastern, I tried to connect with the faculty and the students and the groups who are interested in energy, and I found, you know, there was really across campus, and there were some in engineering, some in the policy school, some in the design and architecture school, and so it was quite distributed, and some in the College of Science. So this, again, this attempt to kind of help network within the university is trying to get researchers from different perspectives, interdisciplinary, to get together and do collaborative proposals and think about innovative research and ways that we can engage there. So, okay, so that was a little bit of an aside, kind of giving you some institutional perspective. And what I want to do now is kind of come back to this idea of energy democracy and talk a little bit more about that. And in particular, I want to emphasize that this notion of energy democracy is really, in a sense, emerged as a resistance to our fossil fuel dominated culture, systems, political framework that we're in. And so it's also a response to growing inequities, racial and socioeconomic inequities, growing unequal distribution of the impacts of both energy and climate, and the political power of the fossil fuel industry. So this is something that, you know, we don't always, I mean, I don't know how much here at Tufts people are talking about the political power of the fossil fuel industry. But it is something that is almost, at this point, you know, so blatant in our federal government that it's no longer even, as, you know, speculation. And we have recent research has shown kind of the strategic misinformation campaign of the fossil fuel industry over decades to confuse the American public about climate science. And so there's the negative kind of cultural influence and political influence of this particular industry is really a key part of what the energy democracy movement is acknowledging and trying to resist and respond to. And so the fossil fuel industry itself is also obviously among the most profitable industries in the world, characterized even in its own structure by income inequality in terms of few people at the top are profiting a lot and others are not. And it's supported by public resources in terms of subsidies that our government provides. And as I mentioned, this intentional misinformation campaign on climate science is a big deal, and it's you know, similar to the tobacco industry's attempts to claim that smoking doesn't cause cancer or isn't unhealthy, and so there's some similar parallels there. One of the things to think about with this, and this relates to the work I've done on thinking about the innovations in the grid system as we envision a future with more renewable, distributed, heterogeneous energy systems with different locally appropriate mix of different renewables. The power of the grid is centralized, not just the technological piece, but also the control, management, and influence of how the grid is managed is very much influenced, again, by some very powerful energy companies. And so this growing social movement is kind of similar in some ways to the local food movement, and it's about bringing back control to communities, and this idea, Boulder, Colorado is an example of a city that is very explicitly thinking about decentralizing, decarbonizing, and democratizing their energy system. They're actually been struggling with their electric utility to kind of divorce themselves so that they can have control locally about how much fossil fuels is in their energy mix. I wanted to put this up. This is a paper that just was published a few months ago that makes some really interesting connections with energy and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think this is important because, again, it just highlights some of the synergies here that people don't often think about. And this paper kind of is a kind of anthropological paper that talks about how some energy experts are embracing the holistic view of energy and how energy systems are connected with anti-racist activists who are embracing kind of this more technocratic perspective. So there's kind of a meeting in the middle of kind of these different movements that you would think would be quite separate, that wouldn't necessarily always think of connected, but they're kind of learning from each other and influencing each other and noticing some similarities and connections, which is kind of interesting and exciting to think about. So this vision of energy democracy is really about changing from our conventional perspective on energy consumers to thinking more about energy citizens, that energy is a right that we all need to have access to, and thinking about, instead of energy commodities, but thinking about energy as a public good, and thinking about energy infrastructure as public works and common resources. And as I mentioned before, this key point at the bottom here, moving from corporate-controlled energy systems to public and community-controlled systems. So I just wanted to connect this to the book that was mentioned in my introduction that we wrote a couple of years ago. And the take-home message, so this book was about smart grid is similarly thought of as kind of this vision of a different energy system. And what we did in this book is kind of characterize different people's perspectives and visions of what the future could look like and what is the potential of this transformation. And some people put the R in parentheses. So, and that kind of characterizes one of the fundamental themes of doing a whole lot of interviews and focus groups and trying to understand what people are thinking about what's the potential for energy system change, in that some people are thinking about it very much as an incremental change, like everything will stay the same and we'll just get more efficient and but basically we'll have very similar systems and cultural change, social change won't be that big. But other people are really envisioning a big transformation, that our energy system change can, in fact, lead to a very different, a radically different society. And so that kind of spectrum of perspectives we articulated in this book, and I think it's important it's valuable for us to think about where we might lie on this spectrum. So here we've put this up as some of the themes that were in the book about whether people are thinking about energy system change as incremental versus radical change, and more centralized or less centralized. And those were, again, tensions that people have, and we can talk about some of this in the discussion too, in terms of thinking about with renewables. You can have large-scale renewables that are more, that are very centralized still, right? That if one node goes out or one transmission line from a big wind farm to a consumption, urban place, you could still have a very centralized system that could be vulnerable. So this is kind of an interesting way to think about where we are on here in terms of large renewables, community-based, how much cultural change, and how much just more kind of incremental change. And so when I think about the energy democracy movement, I think it's more emphasizing the radical change potential and the decentralization, right? This idea that individuals and households and communities could be self-sufficient, perhaps even, probably part of a larger network and grid, but have a lot of the control and the generation right locally. This paper talks about the energy democracy and goes through different goals in terms of resisting the dominant energy agenda, reclaiming the energy sector, and then restructuring the energy sector. And so that's what some of the key things that are involved in this energy democracy movement are kind of focusing on. And let's see here. It really assumes that distributed energy sources and technologies will enable and organize distributed political power in a different way. So again, that connection with the energy system power with the political power, if we distribute one, there's potential to also distribute political power in a different way. But I think this final point here is really important to recognize that it's also true that the renewable energy systems in and of themselves don't necessarily mean that there will be change in political power. It offers a possibility for a more democratic system, but depending on how it's done, we could still have, big corporate-controlled renewable systems, right? So it depends how it's done, and it's not a necessarily critical link. This was in March when, at the federal level, there was a signing of an executive order on energy, and the prevailing theme for the whole national federal energy strategy right now is energy dominance, which obviously is very different than energy democracy. What else do you notice about this photograph? Yeah. Yeah, so it's all white men, I think. And that is actually, people have critiqued this photograph, and it's actually part of the dominance thing, and it's connected to this vision or this idea of control and using fossil fuels as a way to be strong and dominate other countries and make a lot of money, obviously it's troubling on multiple dimensions. Really interesting. So there's been a rhetorical shift. We've actually had for the theme had been energy independence for a long time, right? Both sides of the political dichotomy, both parties have focused on energy independence as like a theme, that we want to be independent from other countries, right? And so that has been justification for more fossil fuel extraction at times, but also a justification for renewables, because if we have more renewables, then we don't need to get as much foreign fossil resources. But this new era that we're in of American energy dominance is really a very different orientation, and obviously it's almost antithesis of energy democracy. So I had a colleague at the University of Idaho has been also looking at this, and so I adapted the slide from her presentation she gave, where she actually compared these two ideas of energy democracy and energy dominance. And so obviously some of these are quite obvious, but it's worth kind of going through that, that energy democracy is really focused on future-oriented and this focus on transition, whereas energy dominance perception is really nostalgic, focused on reclaiming a mythical past that, oh, we're going to bring coal back, we're going to bring jobs in coal, and kind of this yearning for a time that is no longer sort of thing. The focus on community control versus centralized control and corporatocracy, with the CEO of former CEO of ExxonMobil being our Secretary of State. There's some direct connections with kind of corporate benefits that are clearly happening within the energy dominance space. The public good versus the good for just a few people. Shared political voice, obviously, is a goal of energy democracy, and in the energy dominance, it's very much a masculine power voice, a totalitarianism and kind of controlling voice. Adaptive versus fixed in terms of thinking about how the future might be. And obviously in the energy dominance framework, climate change isn't there, social good, the commons, kind of the whole thinking about how we are, kind of living together and thinking about the well-being of everybody is at odds with, obviously, the energy democracy framing, which is much more focused on sustainability, efficiency, and conservation. So the other thing that I just wanted to mention here, which is another big idea that I've been having increasingly as I explore some of this, is that so many of our systems, including our energy system, are actually perpetuating inequalities rather than reducing inequalities. And we are, you know, in general, the trends toward growing inequality in our society have been increasing. And I've argued here that we are, unless we're very intentionally paying attention to the implications and the justice impacts and the disparate access that people have, we are actually a lot of times doing good things, potentially, in terms of good, and we're also perpetuating inequality. So example here with renewables is a lot of the renewable energy policy has been trying to incentivize renewable deployment, and a lot of it has gone to homeowners who get a benefit and a big reduction in the cost of putting solar on their roofs, for example, and then they have free electricity, basically, for the rest of their lifetime or the lifetime of the house. And that, in and of itself, you know, is only available to certain groups of our society, people who have homeowners, who are homeowners, and people who have access to some capital that they can make this investment. And so I think there's a growing recognition of the importance of, as we make these shifts toward renewables, of making sure that the incentive structures and the benefits are distributed among people and communities and individuals in a way that doesn't actually end up exacerbating the gaps that we already are struggling with. So I think there's a big opportunity for additional research on inequality and minimizing the components of the energy system change that are related to inequality. I actually have I have more slides and I could talk longer, but I'd prefer to kind of open it up and have more of a discussion for the remaining 20 minutes or so. So what I'm going to do is just click through some of this. I was going to talk about some work on gender that I've done, and I guess I could just summarize that I've done some work, and I think it's worth all of us considering. In a male-dominated sector like the energy sector, what influence does that lack of diversity among the people making decisions about our energy system, how does that impact the decisions that are being made? And I think it's quite clear that greater diversity, and there's all kinds of research on diversity, and not just gender diversity, other kinds of diversity as well, leads to more innovation, more new ideas, and more potentially also more attention to environmental issues, right? And so that is an important thing to be thinking about. I'll end here with just mentioning the National Council for Science on the Environment has a council of energy and research and education leaders, and I'm involved in that. It's a national organization trying to help universities improve their energy curriculum, energy minors, certificates, whatever, different things. Because if you think about where in the university you can study energy, for most of us, it's not always clear, right? And it's not just an engineering thing. And even if it was engineering, with the renewable technologies out there, you wouldn't know if you should be in mechanical or electrical engineering, or but then the policy and the social and the economics and the all kinds of opportunities for social science and social study of energy systems. So I encourage you to be thinking about that in your own curriculum and if you're able to, and in what ways are you able to think about integrate energy into the things you're learning about. And again, just returning to this notion of here we are at a university, I work at a university, you're here at a university. How can universities engage on these issues of particularly the renewable energy transition or sustainability more broadly or issues of resilience? Conventionally, we can do innovations in our teaching and our research that's more interdisciplinary and engaged. The campus itself, obviously, is a microcosm of society. We can demonstrate innovative things. We can invest in innovations of different kinds. And then community engagement is another piece that we're all, exploring different ways that universities can be kind of an intermediary organization, an honest broker, convening people to talk about issues that are difficult and aren't going to get talked about in the same way anywhere else or in other settings. So I just, again, I don't know everyone's background here, but I think it's valuable to be thinking organizationally of where we are and what are the opportunities, and try to take advantage of the changing opportunities for how universities can engage. And so I'll end here with just saying that the energy transformation has huge potential for social, economic, and political change. Resistance is intensifying, I guess, on some level. Obviously, there's a lot of things going on and a lot of uncertainty about how things are going to be in the future. So it's a very uncertain time in a lot of respects. But arguably, the renewable transformation and ultimate moving away from fossil fuels, even if we start using more fossil fuels for a while, it's still going to be happening. So paying attention to that and thinking about implement mechanisms for diversifying who's involved, who's benefiting from the changes, and who's making decisions. And if intentional exclusion of diverse voices, like this is an example. We're having a lot of intentional exclusion of diverse voices right now in lots of venues. If that is not strongly challenged, the situation could get worse, and we all really need to not be silent and not be passive and get involved, and so that we don't perpetuate or just accept what we're told kind of is good for us in some regards. So anticipate change, and I like this photograph. It's just showing that if you tried to play by the old rules, when the landscape changes, so if you tried to play soccer on that field, it wouldn't really work, right? You wouldn't be able to play the game the way you usually would. So conventional rules, assumptions, and disciplines need to be adjusted, and it's a very dynamic time, and we all kind of need to be responsive in what we're doing and how we're doing things to reflect that. So I think that is it. This is my research team. I work with graduate students, undergraduate students at Northeastern. And I will actually make a plug for, we just are launching a new master's program in environmental science and public policy. And I'm the co-director. And it's really at the interface of policy and science. So it's the background is people who do or do not have science are welcome. And people who do or do not have policy background and may have more science are also welcome. And it's quite a flexible program, and we're launching it, so the first cohort will be starting in the fall of 2018. So if you're interested in that, you can look it up online or ask me any questions about that. And I think that's it. I'll stop there. Thank you.
So questions?
Great presentation, thank you. You skipped quickly through some slides about mothers out front, but you did talk a little bit about gender. And it's an interesting example because it's starting here, but it's becoming a national organization. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about your thoughts about that group. My question in particular is that, to me, it seems a little socially regressive to invite women to participate as mothers. And I'm wondering your take on that. I totally get the need to open the space up, and especially, being confronted with the picture of the white men signing the energy dominant strategy. But yeah, so I just wondered about your take on that group.
Yeah, great question. So some of the slides that I went over quickly, looked at a couple of specific organizations that are embracing some of these energy democracy ideals in different ways, and they are by trying to include different people than are normally included. So one of the organizations is called Grid Alternatives, which is an organization that actually does training for solar installations all around the country in low-income communities, and training people who don't have good jobs to get, opportunities for good jobs. And that's for women and minorities in different communities. The other organization that I mentioned up there is Mothers Out Front, which is a climate advocacy policy organization that you could tell by the name, it represents or has come together with women who are concerned about climate change, and they have a particular orientation of, worried about their children and being a mother and that kind of thing. And so that is, as you mentioned, a growing organization that is having impact at multiple levels in different states now around the country. And they're really advocating for specific policy changes, like, for example, the 100% renewable goal. I think there are multiple different bills at the state in Massachusetts being promoted for renewables. So, and I think the bigger question you asked about the effectiveness or the value of having organizations that are explicitly one cohort of one set of constituents. I think there's definitely, obviously there's apparently value because it's a growing organization that a lot of people are very passionate about, and I think it gives voice in a formal way to a group of people that don't necessarily know how to get their voice into the public discourse. So I think in that sense, there's a lot of value and impact there. I think with all challenges of diversity, when there become self-identified clusters that people go to for support, the flip side is that that you're not fully integrating or things like that can always be perceived but I don't think there's any right or wrong with that. I think that's just the way we navigate these complicated spaces in terms of getting support from people who are similar to us or share some orientation, and then also trying to be involved in bigger conversations. Yeah, good question though.
Well, it reminds me of when you think about Walk Boston kind of initiatives, you've got lots of different organizations that are putting pressure from different angles, and so you might almost argue that it's better to have multiple organizations, because is 4 organizations of different constituencies more powerful than a single organization? So what are your thoughts about sort of the numbers of organizations required to be most effective? Can you say if there were 10, it's better than 8, but 12 is too many, or what?
Well, I mean, that's the whole idea with the energy democracy movement, is to be as inclusive as possible and to encourage people to look at these issues from lots of different priorities, right? Lots of different perspectives. So the connection that I mentioned in terms of social justice and Black Lives Matter with climate change, I mean, a lot of people don't think of those connecting, yet there's some powerful synergies there. Similarly, I mean, in terms of, so I think we're also talking about all different scales of local, and so I mean, there's no number in terms of magic number, but I think there's alignment among the lots of different organizations and lots of different people coming from different backgrounds, all recognizing something similar. There's a fundamental problem here and an opportunity by connecting the different priorities. So I think that's the powerful piece. Maybe if you could introduce yourself too.
I'm Julie Berkman, and I'm a local Medford citizen. Mm-hmm. And so I'm very excited by the things you've put forward, and I'm particularly interested in the business of the decentralization and maybe the radical change as we in Medford are looking at national grids. I'm trying to look forward in terms of, okay, 100%, we're not there yet. We now have a choice on our national grid to elect to use a network of solar panels somewhere. So how do we, the radical change, I guess, would be, we're still going with the corporate, we're attaching renewables to the corporate, and at what point would we be comfortable enough to like take it off the grid? Because the grid is supplying all the houses, you know, there is the connectivity.
Right.
So I don't see how we get there from here.
Yeah.
I have one other question that has to do with the trade in the U.S. with China in terms of the solar panels, but if you don't get to that, that's okay.
Okay, so the question about the connectivity and also the utility. So I've actually done some work about exploring electric utilities as organizations that are, you know, they're constrained in what they can do by the regulatory oversight that they have. So innovation within electric utilities is kind of structurally limited. And so that's a whole area of exploration of how the electric utilities that we're also reliant on, many communities are, can help us with more radical transformation. And there's that's where institutional innovation has to happen, right? And there are people advocating for changes, and it's definitely on the horizon, and there's a spectrum of electric utilities. Some are actually quite innovative. Green Mountain Power in Vermont is an electric utility that's a B corporation, and they're really trying to advance and work with their customers to be an energy service provider rather than a provider of electricity, right? They want to help people get the solar panels and the batteries and be independent and self-sufficient. The other part of your question, I think, was about the, decentralization. So the other thing I was just going to say about that is I think it is, that it's hard to, I think that's the challenge. We can have this radical vision, but how to get there, right? And obviously it's baby steps, it seems like a lot of the time. And things can and potentially will start to change faster at some point. And I think the amount of renewables already and the acceleration, a lot of us don't really have a sense of the scale of that, and it's actually quite remarkable just in the past 5 years. And the price of solar has gone down and all of this, and that relates to the trade question. But so things are actually changing, and there's obviously still a long way to go, yeah.
So I was just going to ask about like the social and political consequences of like labor in this, and how like currently, obviously. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Oh, there are people. Oh, didn't realize that. Sorry. So I was going to ask, about how obviously like corporations in the fossil fuel industry have a huge sway politically with their capital, but another thing they have is laborers. And so like unfortunately one of the what can be one of the failures of the movement is getting those laborers on board and understanding that like the corporations they're working for are actually like kind of assisting their own demise. So like are there any people working that you know of or any institutions that are working to transition labor from fossil fuel directly to renewable energy?
Yes. So there are several kind of explicit attempts to do that. You're right, though, that a lot of the training for renewable jobs has not been directly connected with the people who might be losing their jobs, right, in terms of fossil orientation. So I think in Pennsylvania, where there are, coal workers losing their jobs, there are some, I've just read about anecdotally of some programs where they're being trained in solar, a direct kind of connection. But you're right that a lot of the labor opportunities and disruptions are not matched clearly, right? And the jobs that are, new jobs that are emerging are in places that are not in the same place as the old jobs that are being lost. So there's a lot to be thinking about in terms of jobs, and I think that the distributed renewable vision that the energy democracy kind of lens puts forward would ultimately result in a lot more jobs than the fossil fuel system. So there's a macro level perspective of a lot more jobs, not just installation, but we could be manufacturing and installing and operation once things are in place in terms of minimal maintenance and things like that. And especially if it's distributed, there could be jobs all over the country, right? The jobs themselves could also be distributed, right? Every community could have new jobs, not just the hubs, potentially. And this is the possibility. But you're right in terms of the job losses are obviously a big concern, and that's we can see it in the national discourse. It's raised, it's bigger than even the numbers. The significance of it in the national discourse is bigger than the numbers actually warrant. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the number of jobs that are being lost are not as big as you might think based on the discourse. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. There's a lot of potential there, for sure. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mika Vanderlansum. I work in the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy at the Fletcher School up the hill there. And thank you for your great presentation. Are there any good examples of countries or states or even cities that are either have a democratic energy system or working towards that? Are there some success stories? Or?
Yeah. So at the national level, Germany is the country that has a national energy policy for transitioning away from both fossil fuels and nuclear toward a renewable-based energy system. And they're obviously a big country, very influential, and it has industry. So they are definitely held up as the country that is struggling with a lot of it's not a smooth sailing transition there either. And, people point to like, oh, well, look at the problems they're having, therefore it's not possible, or therefore, there's challenges. And so, but again, within this larger framework, you would expect, of course, there's going to be tension and there's going to be disruption and there's going to be problems. But a lot of the German growth in renewables has been at the community level and kind of very grassroots and community-based renewable deployment, more so than big corporate or large-scale. There's been both, but a lot of that. So I think that at the national level would definitely be the most prominent country to point to. And then I think there are examples kind of all over that are people have goals of, and working toward. And my sense is, again, studying kind of the energy democracy framing, a lot of it is actually urban context because it's people concerned about the social justice issues and the jobs and trying to connect those issues. So there's a lot of the energy democracy movement and organizations that are using that phrase that are actually in the urban context in the United States. And they're, again, trying to connect these social justice issues with energy and climate.
Well, let's thank Jennie Stevens one more time. Jennie has to run to class, but if you want to learn more about her program, or I would strongly encourage you to visit their website and explore the Resilience Institute there at Northeastern. So thank you for coming.